Thank you very much. I think we find ourselves at a pretty interesting time. We've been through the last 4 or 5 years, which have been tough to say the very least. An environment which has been some of our own doing and some of the global markets, be it the global financial crisis or be it our own fractured coalition governments, where you've really seen policy paralysis. All of it led to a market which was struggling with high interest rates, tough capital markets, both on the private and the public side, high inflation, and really slowing growth, leading to a reasonably depressing sentiment. All of that over the last 6, 8, 10 months seems to be changing. We've, against the run of play, run into a government which is a single majority, has a perception of being pro-business, makes all the right noises. We've got the oil prices and the global markets working in our favor. Our biggest import of oil prices have gone down, resulting in a huge positive for us. Moving on to a situation where other emerging markets, which clamor for the same kind of capital that we do, running themselves into some trouble because of some reason or the other. And you've got a mood which is positive. I have to confess, when we were talking earlier, through all our investments that we've made, I haven't seen anything change on the ground as yet. While there's a lot of positive talk and a lot of positive sentiment, not much on the ground has changed in terms of just cash flows and business movement. But I guess that's understandable given that there is always a lag between sentiment and the final move towards the real action on the ground, so to speak. Our panelists over here represent, the senior professionals represent very, very important investment firms in the country. They play, well, in different areas, play different roles, be it some of them creating ideas into real businesses, and others, such as Mahesh and Vibhav and their organizations, playing roles in making small businesses into large, structured, solid companies. I'll try and break it'll be good to get a view from all of them as to what they see in the next few years coming up and going on. In addition to that, anything else that you all want to add, and in the end we'll open it up to everybody in the hall over here. What I'd like to break up the discussion for this segment really would be 3 main areas, which is kind of broadly form the core of what we do, and that would be the investment side. So it'll be good to get a sense as to what each of you all think and what you all want to do with the business going forward. Second, and I think the most important part, which I think a lot of investment firms have kind of struggled with, is going to be the portfolio management. Once you've made the investment, I think is when really the tough work starts, and I think it changes with different people, different kind of investments, and the kind of investment in people that you've invested into. So it'll be good to get a sense from each of you all on that front. And then finally, the exit. If we can try and get your views as to which is the most effective way to secure a solid exit and hopefully make some strong returns in the next few years that are coming up. Sohail, I'll start with you. You've actually got a really, really interesting portfolio. While all of us are kind of boxed in with some kind of parameters within which we invest, you have an extremely wide portfolio and a diversified portfolio, be it investments into some of the leading online companies which were young when you invested into them, also into some pretty mature businesses like Yes Bank and ING. Just a quick word, as to how have you and your partners actually built that portfolio out. And also, have you all, for all of you all actually, have you all have a slightly different approach when you're investing in India as opposed to other different markets?
Sure. So as you said, thanks, Kabir. We do have an interesting philosophy which is different from many other firms investing in India. We invest across the spectrum, so we write checks as small as $2 million and as large as $50 million and more. And we invest in sort of very early stage ideas which are a man with a plan. And one company we funded in that space is Pepperfry. It's a leading online furniture retailer. And we also invest in listed companies like Yes Bank and IndusInd Bank. the way we decide what to do, what to invest is we look at everything on a risk-adjusted basis. So obviously, if we are investing in more mature businesses, which are later stage or listed, we would expect to make lower returns, but then with commensurately lower risks. Whereas on our earlier stage deals, we just look at making a much larger multiple of our money, and also the amount of money we put out is relatively limited. In India, this strategy we think has been interesting because what we've tended to do is whenever the public markets and the late stage private market valuations go up, we switch focus to earlier stage businesses, and then as the valuation turns around, we move from early stage and then start doing stuff in the markets, and that's worked relatively well for us. In terms of how India is different from the US, clearly, which is sort of our home market and where we've got the bulk of our investment portfolio, clearly very, very different in terms of just a number of aspects. I think for the most important for us would just be the type and the quality of entrepreneurs. I think in India we are seeing a lot of great entrepreneurs come through, and the ecosystem is starting to develop, particularly in some of the newer fields like online and e-commerce. But still, compared to the US and compared to more mature markets, the entrepreneurs here are less seasoned. For most of them, this is the first venture they're doing. You see very few repeat entrepreneurs, and that's just a very different sort of. You need a very different skill set to evaluate Indian entrepreneurs from what you would get in the West. I think, and I won't take much more time. The other thing I think which is very different is just the regulatory and business environment, which is clearly very different. In India, our philosophy is we want to stay as far away from governments as possible, as far away from governmental interference. We want to be in unregulated businesses because clearly regulation here is difficult and difficult to get your heads around, which may or may not be the case in the Western markets.
Thank you very much. Mark, you run a very I think the most different investment platform. You focused on food products and agri-product companies, service companies, much earlier stage. What's been your experience, and how did you actually stumble into this? Because it's really is a niche.
Well, Omnivore started 4 years back. Basically, my background is agribusiness management and agricultural technology, and I had moved to India as part of a turnaround team that was hired into Godrej Agrovet when that business wasn't doing very well. And after 4 years, it was in much stronger shape, and we were getting ready. We were looking at doing a private equity deal, which eventually was the Temasek deal that was done in December 2012. But in advance of that, saw that there was essentially very, very little capital at all for entrepreneurs that were doing non-traditional venture investing. So if you came to, primarily because most VCs in India were essentially satellites of American venture funds, or the handful of domestic ones had a fairly narrow focus. And when you looked at the early stage part of this market, if you were trying to launch a new business and you were in the ag space or food space, very hard to get funding, right? It was practically impossible. And yet, and I had seen this from my vantage point running M&A in Godrej Agrovet, there were a lot of entrepreneurs that were starting companies, it's just they weren't getting any money, right? So they would operate for a couple of years on a shoestring and maybe shut down, and there wasn't, and there were a few exceptions to this, and the one big exception was coming out of Nexus Venture Partners.
Okay.
And it so happened that I knew the CFO there, and said, I'm thinking about asking the Godrejes to back a fund that would just focus on this space, on early stage ag and food companies. Do you want to join me? And Janesh quit his job, and we launched Omnivore together. He had done a couple of the ag-related deals that Nexus had done, and Godrej came in as an anchor investor, and we went out and raised from, it's not a huge fund, it's a 260 crore fund, and we raised it from pretty much half H&I money. We were distributed by Barclays Private Wealth, and then the other half was Indian financial investors.
Okay.
so large banks and insurance companies. We didn't really raise abroad. We didn't raise abroad. We raised an entirely rupee-denominated fund, and we've been investing ever since. We've just about 80% invested at
Wow.
this point, because from a transaction perspective, we're active. I mean, we're not Bloom Ventures active, but we're active, right? It's
No, I mean, I think we'll actually dig more into the kind of stuff that you're doing because I think it's extremely interesting and it's completely differentiated, unlike a lot of other investors. But Mahesh, you've been in the financial service industry forever and ever, and on the investing side, Vibhav and you are kind of do similar kinds of transactions, real growth investing in India. You've gone out and you've been doing that. Can you tell us a little bit about how you see the market, how you see investments, getting into them? What are your key focus areas, and how do you go about evaluating them?
Sure. Thanks, Kabir. Let me begin by saying that, look, we are a late-stage private equity fund investing in growth, for growth, and investing in controlled transactions. We are a large fund and a global fund, so we are a dollar-denominated fund. Currently manage close to around $7.3 billion globally, but invest only in emerging markets, China, India, Africa, Latin America. In the Indian context, so far the aggregate value of our investments is approximately $1.7 billion. And the size of deals that we'll end up doing is essentially north of $50 million, ideally $100 million or so per company. 4 sectors of focus: consumer, healthcare, financial services, and industrials. And if I were to tell you the split between the $1.7 billion would be approximately 55% in controlled transactions where we do buyouts, and the rest is in minority investment. You'll wonder how in a growth market like India, buyout transactions still happen. Well, the fact of the matter is that Indian enterprise is also aspirational, wants to go global. And sometimes for want of not being able to fulfill the aspirations, we find family-owned businesses allowing themselves to go either into minority or selling out completely. And we've been fairly successful in this journey because we've had the benefit of following a sector-led approach where we actually invest time way early than the deal that comes to market, convincing families and promoters that perhaps marrying a fund and actually fulfilling global aspirations is the right way to do so. And we bring in professional management teams on board in controlled transactions. We drive operational improvements through an operating partner model, where these are guys who worked in the same sectors and who've contributed to actually running those businesses in the past, but who know it all, who then come in and partner with us and then drive the agenda, which is value creation. And the eventual exit in most of the controlled transactions, invariably, when I say invariably, 99% is sale to a strategic or a trade sale buyer of a business. It is completely the reverse in a minority transactions where, in the Indian context, most sponsors and promoters prefer investing money from private equity for growth, but eventually listing and providing an exit route to the private equity business. Coming back to our view about India, we certainly believe that India is rightly positioned and placed. Whether the markets have gone through the painful period of the last 3 years is behind you. But I guess if you were to look at the world in the context of where world is looking to invest for growth, India still presents one opportunity where there is growth to go for. There is a large demographic dividend that we still have to play for. And there is still a lot of underpenetration in many sectors across the board. And you will find that if you were to break this out into different sectors, every sector will present unique challenges and opportunities for you to play. But you got to then decide where your priorities are and what role you wish to play, and just go for it. Yes, it's a competitive market. Just providing capital is not enough any longer. You got to figure out how marriage of capital and human capital becomes that much more relevant for you to create value and deliver value.
Well, I'm going to ask you one more question, actually, just because you have a play in China and India. My personal experience is, my personal take, right or wrong, is that I do believe that they're pretty similar countries in the sense that they're both commoditized, they're both emerging. Obviously, China, according to me, is 15 years ahead of us, if not more. But it'll be good to get a sense. I mean, is your investment going into an investment philosophy? And I'll also ask you the same question when we actually get to the portfolio management side. Is it the same in China with your partners in China as it is when you follow it back in India, or is it slightly different?
At this point in time, I think the only difference between China and India for us has been that China is in the forefront for our investing in, let's say, the consumer sector and the healthcare space. We've done controlled transactions even in China.
Okay.
We're finding it not difficult at all to do controlled deals even in China. We've done fairly large ones both in the quick service restaurant space, in the education space, and very recently in the healthcare space. And the difference between China and India, invariably when you sit on an investment committee, always is, why is China so cheap and why is India always expensive?
Correct.
And that's the call that you got to take at different points in time for a particular business. But opportunities exist even in China. It's a large market, much larger than India, yes, of course. But the difference between China and India is that in China, you talk more often to professionals or to professionals who ran successful state-owned enterprises are now wanting to run private businesses. In the Indian context, you will talk largely to owners, sponsors of businesses, and very less to even management teams. The contrary is true in the buyout situation, where you may perhaps back a management team to run a business and back them with capital, and they use that capital to aggregate businesses that you want to make of size and scale.
Okay. Well, thank you. Vibha, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you and your firm see in India and your investment approach?
Sure, thanks. So Standard Chartered Private Equity is 100% owned by Standard Chartered Bank. We are managing close to $6 billion invested globally, approximately $1 billion invested in India. We've been investing in India since the year 2000. So having been invested for 14 years, we've actually seen close to 3 economic cycles, invested, harvested, and ultimately got out of companies, and we've experimented with each of the 3 most commonly used exit routes as well, taking companies public, selling to other private equity funds, and also selling to strategic investors. So I think you raise an interesting analogy between India and China. So we are, of course, focused on investing in emerging Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. But even among all of these emerging markets, India has been and probably will continue to remain the most expensive market. So I think what we have done as a team over time is got our investment committee comfortable with the fact that India is and will remain an expensive market, combined with the fact that growth can never be a given. So I think a lot of funds that invested, say 5, 7, 8 years ago, thinking that one could pay any valuation and growth was a given, I think never ended up making the kind of returns that we would have liked. So from our perspective, I think we lay, of course, an enormous emphasis on the quality of the business, but the quality of the entrepreneur is probably the single most important factor for us when we talk of late stage investing or the kind of investing we do.
Well, we've made a few investments, in fact, and we've done all controlled transactions thus far. Control's the wrong side. We actually own each of our businesses 100% ourselves. One thing that we've kind of been a little bit more conscious about is when we've gone out to invest, if the check that we're willing to write is $30 million, we've always kept close to another $10 million on the sidelines, because we just feel everything just takes longer and everything takes more money to reach the same target. I don't know whether each of you all, whether you all feel the same way and have experienced the same thing, and what are when you're getting into an investment, how conscious are you about the follow-on round? Because very often you will need that extra dollar, and the markets may or may not be willing to, may or may not be there to pull you out or help you grow at that given point. But that's kind of our strategy. I'd love to get your sense on that.
So at least from our perspective, since we're a bank-owned fund, we don't necessarily need to keep capital aside.
Right.
As and when we need, we always go back and we get access to capital. But you're absolutely right that getting into an underfunded investment situation is recipe for disaster. So I think a lot of anyone's diligence, time, and effort goes in establishing that whatever investment you're consummating is enough for at least 2 years out, and that chances of the companies getting strapped for cash 6 months into the investment is never seen.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what we've also seen. Mark, this I guess is even more true in your case because you come in at really early stages. We as a market in India we don't have the most active venture capital market. I mean the depth in terms of numbers of investors and people is not pretty much there. So the Series A that you participate in very often gets stuck because the Series B rounds we don't have the depth on the Series B and the Series C side. I think it also kind of holds true, but they kind of write, a person like Sohail and Norwest would write bigger checks. How do you play this out when you're making your investments?
Well, sorry as I drop my mic. I think the issue of undercapitalization is a big one, and I've actually said that I think that when we first got started, the first couple of deals we did, we actually undercapped, right? It was, we were the only players in the space. We were writing, what we thought were fair pre-money valuations for early stage ventures. There wasn't a huge amount of deal competition. And I think it was a valuable lesson that, in general, the companies, when you write a Series A round in venture investing, you usually want the money to last 18 months, right? 18 to 24 months is probably a fair amount of time. And these guys were burning through it in like 12. And so now some of the reason for burning through it was actually growth. We were mostly investing in businesses that were actually at gross margin positive, sales positive, right? We're not doing 3 kids at IITK with a nice idea, right? So we're investing in businesses that have some sales traction before we come in. But they were really burning through the initial Series A rounds very, very fast. And so we kind of did 2 things. One is that if you look today, the Series A check that we write is twice as big on average as it was when we got started 3 years ago. And as we budget our second fund now, probably a year from now, my assumption is going to be, right, if we originally were looking at a Series A of $1 million, now it's more like a Series A of $2 million, right? And in my head, kind of, it's going to wind up being a Series A of $3 million. So there is a convergence. And again, this is not e-commerce, take the money, put it in a corner, and set it on fire, right? Though it is nice that Uber is free this week, right? You should all use that. But 5 free rides, just to advertise someone else's company. But so we see that the average round size is creeping up, and a lot of that is because the growth is faster than we expected. The cost of talent is higher. The companies are looking at more global opportunities, and so they are in fact needing a larger Series A. The second thing that we did is we started writing a lot of convertible debt. Right, so we immediately realized that all of these companies that we undercapped, we were like, okay, mea culpa. How much did you need for a proper size round? And we wrote the rest of it as convertible debt to price when they do a Series B. And so that's how we kind of made up this capital shortfall. And I think the issue with you said a lack of investors. I do think it's been a bit of a transition time in Indian VC. There are people that have started leaving the market that didn't have a great experience. But there are also new people coming in. So I think net it's a more active space, especially on the early stage than it ever was, right? There are definitely more angel investors, more organized angel investors than ever. So I think the depth of the Series B space is still pretty okay. And I think what you see in India is a Series A round that is kind of an Indian Series A round, which I heard joked a few weeks ago is like a Silicon Valley seed round, right? And then the Series B round in India is like an A round in the US. But I think there is an element of convergence that is definitely happening in the later rounds.
I mean, so Sohail, you've participated in a lot of early stage. I'm sure. I mean, this doesn't hold true in many ways in some of the later investment, mature investment that you made, say in a Yes Bank and stuff, because they just have a much higher ability to tap global markets or local markets. But when you're looking at smaller, when you're looking at young online businesses, I mean, it's kind of different, right? Because you're still cutting a good check. When you cut down a real sum of money like $20 million, are you again looking, I mean, I don't know whether you're looking at an 18-month period, but are you looking at some cash flow numbers? How do you find yourself, being able to get to that point,
Sure.
the next round?
So, firstly, I think just in general, and this was to an earlier point you made, companies never hit their plans. We've got 35 investments in India. Of them, one company has hit its plans consistently. The other 34 missed. So we just factor that in when we sort of allocate capital. Secondly, I think the e-commerce space where we've done most of our sort of early stage investments is very unique in India in a sense that companies are getting valued and getting interest in later rounds based on how quickly they are able to grow. So what we are seeing is that companies are significantly exceeding the growth projections we have for them, but that costs a lot of money because most of these companies are burning a significant amount of money, and for every incremental dollar they need to generate of revenue, they need to burn a little bit more. So we are seeing rounds we are seeing funding rounds getting exhausted in under 12 months, sometimes 6 to 8 months. So you just raise one round and then the company immediately starts raising the next round. But we are also seeing stratospheric growth at the middle, at least on the revenue basis. You're seeing companies double and triple in size in 3 to 6 months. But that's something I think which is very unique to the e-commerce internet space in India. In other places where we've done sort of early stage investing and also our later stage deals, we're neither seeing that kind of stratospheric growth, nor are we seeing burn rates, nor are we seeing sort of such quick utilization of capital. And then in most cases, the rounds last for 2.5 years. Also, once a company, I mean, our key benchmark is we want to get the company to break even as quickly as possible, because once it reaches break even, you're really safe. Your company isn't going to explode. Worst case, you grow a little slower. If you can't raise capital or you don't get capital at the valuations you think, you're still okay. The company will survive. But it's really for those early stage companies which burn a lot of money that access to capital becomes absolutely critical.
Thank you. Mahesh, quick question. I mean, once you made the investment, and this is, given your way of investing, I think this can form a small part of the next answer or your next view. But really, once you're in the business, you mentioned about how you work with specialists in the field. I've kind of been on the operating side for a while, and we've started businesses, and I've been on the traditional private equity side. I think the one very, what I think is a really tough balance to get is where do you stop adding value and when do you become a pain? And I know, and I'll kind of break that out. I think, again, Mark, I know is extremely passionate about this, so I'd love to get your views on that too, Mark. But at what point do you become too intrusive, and what's the right balance, if there is a right balance? And can you give it to us in terms of you've done half controlled transactions and half minority? Would love your views on both actually, if it's possible.
Sure. So
and the follow-on of money. How often do you go out and actually follow up your initial investment? It will be a small part of that answer too.
Okay, let me start the last question first.
Okay.
Since we are a late stage fund, normally we spend a lot of time when people come to us for funding. And most often, even in a controlled transaction or in a minority situation, we are dealing essentially with growth. So we try and sit down and try and assess what's been budgeted for that CapEx plan, how much is it going to cost the company from their own estimate, but we do our own. We spend a lot of time doing diligence. Again, we bring in experts on board who give us their estimates, both on cost as well as time. And we then question the company that, what is scenario, what's plan B, plan C? And if they were not to be satisfactory, we then actually convince them that what they've actually worked on based on our own inference, that's the right way to go. And we would budget both for a large check to be written upfront, or company's ability to actually leverage if the business can warrant more leverage on the books. If it were still to play out and we need to still invest more money, large part of our late stage fund investing allows us to keep aside 10% of the vintage of that fund for follow-on investments, and which we always can bank upon. It doesn't mean that every single investment we've done out of that vintage will obviously fall back on that 10%. Coming back to your question about intrusive management versus offhand management of businesses, I think the situation is dramatically different when it comes to minority investment and control or buyout investing. So in a minority, I'm sitting on the board with a owner-driven business which is run by him, with me owning maybe 10% going up to, let's say, 40%. He drives the business, he drives with his management team what the business is supposed to deliver. And upfront at the time of discussing the deal with him when we are investing for growth, there are these questions about what can we do with this business if we were to benchmark the business with, let's say, 4 or 5 other global businesses or Indian businesses at the same point in time. And there are these questions asked about why is operating margin X versus Y, why is working capital Y versus Z, and the likes, multiple things. These are just a few examples of what I am just referring right now. And you kind of get the answers. At that point in time, it's your duty to actually engage with the sponsor and push them a little harder to say, what if you were to do this based on a tweak that we've seen done in the following cases in some other similar sector in this part of the world, and maybe we've invested in a similar business in India, and this has been our experience. If he were to say that yes, he's convinced and he will ask his team to deliver, then we would ask his team to deliver and incentivize the team to deliver. However, if you were to say, no, I don't know how to do it and I need your support, then we would at the outset agree to that plan upfront. Because there is no way in the world that you can get on to a minority investment with a promoter-driven company, influencing him later at the board, saying that this is still a change that can do wonders for both him and us, but he would not buy in easily. So it's better that you do it upfront. The situation is completely the opposite in a controlled transaction, because there you own 50% or more of the voting capital of the business. You are actually either backing a promoter who's gone into minority, or you're backing a management team. And more often than not, again, the management team would want you to actually exercise that level of influence at the board level and drive that agenda through a set of advisors that most of us in private equity on the control side work with. So these are either experts who've been CEOs, CTOs of businesses that they run in the similar space, who are actually also on the board with you, or if they're not on the board, they do join the strategic advisory management councils of those businesses to help you, deliver that value creation agenda. There again, it's the management team's job to deliver that uptick in value, and you got to actually guide them, mentor them, and get that agenda going for you. Because if they don't buy in, it's futile an exercise to bring experts on board. So there are challenges in both, but it's always better, and I would recommend that have the buy-in from both the stakeholders, be it a owner, sponsor, or the management team, rather than just saying that you are private equity, you know it all, you've done it all, you've been successful all the time. It doesn't work. It's better to get the buy-in and then do it.
Right. I mean, Vibhav, have you used a lot of operating consultants in your portfolio businesses, and have they yielded the right results? Because the gap eventually is in the execution. I mean, we can talk whatever we want in the boardrooms, where it's the execution.